I think I'm recording.
And so part of our project was to enumerate the damage without getting too tied up in it. So that's where we started. And for those of you who are here this evening, some of you remember it with horror, and those of you who came after, you're still seeing some of the scars. A review of the watershed was a necessary part of our familiarity with the project. I hope you can see my cursor, but the northern flow is the Quackenkill coming down from Grafton down Route 2, then coming across Brunswick, and then merging with the lower main stem of the Postenkill. The Postenkill starts up in Dyken Pond. It's an interesting question. How do you know where any stream starts? It starts at all of its headwaters, but people like to say that it starts at Dyken Pond. Any one of these headwater streams, they converge, they flow through the town of Postenkill and the hamlet centers in Postenkill, and come off the plateau and once again come together with the Quackenkill. And then at a much lower elevation, the combined flow moves through Brunswick and into a section of the river that is very constrained. It's a small river at this point, Postenkill Creek stream, very constrained, very steep walled, and comes charging through the city of Troy, over the Mount Ida Dam, and through what are basically vertical walls to separate the creek from the city center, and joins the Hudson River. So this was the challenge, and the assignment was the focus was floodwater management. The focus was not particularly ecological restoration. The focus was not eel migration. The focus was flood management. And so sometimes that became a question of how do we integrate what are all valuable premises, but that's the focus. All right, let's see, I have to do this again. How did I do it the last time? I figured out how to move down a slide using a button that I wasn't expecting to use. There we go. All right, so there's a substantial elevation shift from the plateau down to Brunswick and Troy. There's approximately 500-foot drop from kind of the plateau elevation down to the Brunswick and then Troy elevation. And for those of you who live on the plateau, I'm only telling you what you know, but it's very impressive. And for a Hyde Park boy, it was really fun to come up and start thinking about what this means and how one might be able to look at floodwater management in this kind of a context. There are lots of wetlands and flood zones. These light greens and the dark greens the light greens are mostly open water bodies, and the dark greens are wetlands. There's a lot of them up here on the plateau. And then as the Quackenkill and the Postenkill come off of the plateau, you see more of the pink, which are flood zones. And so, one question that one asks is, why are the pink zones where they are, and why is there less of that and more wetlands and lakes in the eastern part of the watershed? And it has a lot to do with topography, and it also has a lot to do with the convergence of water. The further downstream you are, the more of a convergence of volume you have. And so particularly then when there are flat areas, as there are in Brunswick, there's a lot of potential for flooding. These hillshade GIS maps that our GIS people make, I think, are so beautiful because you really get a sense as to the texture of the landscape. And as a geologist, the difference between the grit and the harder formation material that has stood up against Mother Nature for much longer and more successfully, shall we say, than the softer shale to the west. It reveals sort of the integrity of the landscape. And what you do see up on the plateau is a real dendritic kind of form of streams making their way together and converging on the Poston Kill, but so many feeder streams coming in. And that is sort of an indication geologically that there's not much porosity in either these soils or the geology. A lot of the water stays on the surface and flows on the surface, unlike some places in the state or some places in the United States where you have deep porous geologic formations and the water just sinks in. We don't have much sinking in going on here, particularly on the plateau. So the amount of water that is wicked right back to the sky in the summer by evapotranspiration processes and the rate of water running off of the plateau are the two main places that water go. When I think as a hydrogeologist of landscapes, I'm usually thinking that it's 50, 25, and 25. About 50% of our water budget turns right around and the plants transpire it back up. And that's why our vegetation flourishes and our forests do well. But something like 50% of our annual water budget goes to transpiration processes and never flows in a stream or sinks into the ground. In many places across New York, the remaining 50% is about 50-50. Half sinks into the ground and travels under the ground as groundwater and ultimately ends up in a stream or is intercepted by a well. And 25% flows overland. So I think of it as 50% is divided between overland flow and what you might call informally underland flow, which is groundwater flow. But here on the plateau, that which is not sent right back to the sky as evapotranspiration through plant processes dominantly, a lot of it just runs off because of the gritty nature of the rock and the tight soils. Let's see, how do I get to my next slide? I have to keep figuring this out. Okay, so the land uses are very different, and I don't need to tell this to you, but it was really important for me to understand. Just, let's just talk about colors. Red and pink are sort of your most urban land use categories as planners put land uses onto maps like this. Yellows and browns are the agriculture and large parcel residential. And then the light greens and the dark greens are mostly forest and very lightly settled landscape. So no surprise, there's a real shift in land uses as you come off the plateau, or if you think about it the other way, there's a real shift of land uses as you ascend and enjoy the plateau. So there's a demarcation at that boundary. So we ended up with a 2-element plan. And one was to really focus on resilience. How could we help this watershed? And I say we, meaning you. How could the collective we look to the next major storm and be more resilient? Have fewer road washouts, have fewer places where the stream is just turned into a culvert of rushing boulders. Places where banks are disappearing into the stream. How could we have more resilience? And so can we restore the stream segments to stabilize the bed and the banks and also benefit habitat, which was, a wonderful additional factor to think about. And so we identified some strategic projects. And then the other question is, how can you detain water? To avoid flooding downstream, can you detain some of the water, even temporarily higher in the watershed, so that it doesn't all get to the bottom of the hill at the same time? And if you can detain water strategically, then the flood damage downstream can be reduced. So temporary water detention in existing wetlands is an idea that we'll talk about here. And then if you have a well-advertised storm that's heading your way, can you in fact strategically use some of your dams, releasing water before the storm event arrives so that you accumulate or preset some detention capacity? That assumes you have time, and it also assumes that you have an operative low-level outlet in your dam, and it assumes that you have personnel who are willing to believe the weather prediction and drain their dam, which if the storm doesn't come, can lead people to need to make an awkward explanation to the public. So pre-storm drawdown is a complicated subject, but it's part of the detention conversation. So in the under the category of stream resilience and ecological repair, clearly we were introduced to some of the damaged segments of the post and kill, and to a lesser degree quack and kill, but there were places that, because of the volume of water movement and because of the substrate, the geomorphology of what the water went over, and then perhaps exacerbated by the immediate cleanup efforts or the response efforts that were engaged in right after the storm. There are sections of the stream that are just pretty much straight boulder channels right now. And for those of you who know them, I don't need to say more about them, but they don't meander anymore. They don't have riffles and pools. They are kind of they kind of travel between berms of boulders. And that also means that when there is a rise in the water level, it's difficult for the water to spread out on its natural floodplain. So are there some areas where, for purposes of resilience to future storms, as well as ecological opportunity, can we rewild some of the damaged stream reaches? And this is where Interfluve was super helpful. This is sort of their specialty. Can we remove the artificial berms that were caused by some of the heavy equipment and that block the ability of water to just naturally spread out on what limited floodplain areas there are? And can we restore to a degree some stream beds and riffle pool structures which both slow water down and provide better habitat? So the benefits there are listed, but sediment stabilization is important. Part of the damage that happens downstream during a storm is not just the volume of the water, it's the amount of debris that gets dumped down below that all needs to be mucked out and moved or coped with in some fashion or another. So one of our recommendations was to do this, and there's a sketched scenario there that Interfluve put together as a way of, in fact, reconstructing some of the stream to have more of a meandering aspect and some reinforcement at the bends so that they wouldn't dissipate too quickly. Now, let's see, many of you are familiar with the McChesney Avenue extension. There's a big bend in the lower post and kill that has a big, a cut bank on the outer side. And there's kind of a question as to how rapidly that's expanding and or biting northward, and whether both a home and a road are in jeopardy. I will share with you sort of the conclusions before going too far. In subsequent slides, I'm going to talk to you about some ways we are proposing to try to detain more water higher in the watershed, which would hopefully slow down the rate of erosion taking place here. And that's what's allowing us to issue a recommendation to monitor this, pay attention to it and measure it, so that it's not just an eye check every once in a while that says, oh, it looks like it's worse or not, but actually put some stakes in there and survey them and figure out, is it moving on a 5-year basis, on a 10-year basis, and then you know how to plan. And then there are some extremely expensive, but there are some possible ways to stabilize it if it's in fact moving. And some of that might have to do with, in fact, lowering the bench on the inside, so that instead of all the water traveling on the outside, it could cross on the inside and slow the rate of damage on the upside. So that's a particular project on McChesney Avenue extension area. So now let's see here. There's an education component to our recommendations. Clearly, there have been some instances where structures were constructed in floodplains, and to educate people and refine zoning to make sure that doesn't happen too often in the future is good. Look for opportunities strategically to move things out of those zones. and also to provide guidance to towns on pre-flood and post-flood actions. There's a whole manual that was put together for some of the Catskill communities that ended up attached pretty much wholesale to our report because it was very well written, that just provides action steps after a storm so that your first instinct might not be to just get in the bulldozer and straighten the stream. That's not necessarily the only tool in the toolbox. And so having that pre and post flood education accessible is part of, it was attached to our report. But the place I really want to talk about this evening, because it's kind of the out of the box thinking, is how do we reduce flood peaks? This is a characteristic flood hydrograph. On the left, you see the water level at some sort of low standard creek kind of level. And then there's a storm event. And the storm event comes up, dumps a lot of rain on a landscape, and there is an immediate and very, very sharp rise in the stream. This is pretty normal. And then after the storm is gone, you see that hydrograph peak drop down to, and reapproach. It's called a regression curve. And it reapproaches sort of its normal low level. And you can imagine that the damage that gets done in a watershed happens right here. And it's often over in a matter of hours or a day. You get that peak, and that peak is what is that final 6 inches or a foot that takes out a bridge or grabs a tree that was leaning over the creek and washes out the roots and then takes that tree and uses it as a battering ram moving downstream. It's that peak that spreads out and damages property or floods basements or crests a storm wall or takes out a bridge. And so the mission of the flood manager is not to hide from the volume of water, but see whether there's the potential to take that volume of water and stretch it out over time. And so what you want to do is you want to take that volume of water and delay its transmission through the watershed so that you have the same amount of water, but that the peak is lopped off. And the whole language of floodwater management has to do with delaying water movement so that you don't have one sharp peak, but rather you have a more muted high elevation point. And that concept really drove us to think about some creative options here. It's interesting. Before the pandemic, we've all been to movie theaters, and you get to the end, you go to the Cinemaplex with 8 different movies showing, and you get to the end of your movie, the lights come on, and you discover what you don't really notice mostly when you walk into the movie theater is that it has about 8 exits. It has 2 or 3 that are right into the parking lot and 2 double doors that take you right back into the lobby, which right through the other end of the lobby puts you in the parking lot. The mission of the movie theater is to get people out of those theaters very quickly so that they can do a quick clean and repopulate and start another movie. But by having 6 or 8 doors, they're creating a peak event in the parking lot. And we've all also left a movie theater and then ended up spending 5 or 6 or 7 minutes in our cars trying to get out of the parking lot onto the main road. And if the movie theater instead had only 2 doors, at the end of the movie, the lights would have come up, and it might have taken 20 minutes for people to leave in more of a single file kind of a way, but they would have just as certainly left the movie theater, and the backup in the parking lot would have been avoided. So that's my little, if you can't think about it as a hydrology, think about it as movie theater management. But the concept is, can you reduce the peak by slowing the departure or slowing or removing the peak event? So here's what we came up with. The key to flood management is to slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in. This comes from Jim Tierney, who is very, very high in the DEC food chain. And in the Rensselaer Plateau, it's hard to soak it in. But can we slow it down? Can we spread it out? There are other places where you can soak it in a lot, and it's a really good 3-step phrase. It's just you have to choose the tools that suit your geology. I was telling to Alice that I'm struggling with my share screen this evening. So one place where we can detain it would be in Denim Reservoir. Denim Reservoir it is associated with a quack and kill. It'll pick up that stream segment. It's a very large reservoir. It has a controlled outlet. It can be drawn down before a storm event. It's operated by the state. This would be a concerted communication challenge and opportunity, but assignment certainly, between the town, the watershed community, and the Denim Reservoir management to pay attention to weather patterns and determine whether there are times to do a 24-hour drawdown before a storm event, so that you build some capacity, and that then when that storm comes, you have some volume storage available. This was in fact the only reservoir for which we recommended this option in the watershed. There were a number of other dams. We've studied them, many of them at least briefly. There was one halfway down Route 2. As you approach Grafton, it's a prominent dam. You drive right by coming up Route 2, but it has a very, very small detention capacity. And it has no active control to lower it down beforehand. So from many people's perspective, it's what might be called a run of river dam. During a storm event, if 100 gallons a minute is flowing in, 100 gallons a minute is flowing out. There's not much storage capacity. And so from the perspective of flood management, we dismissed it as much of a tactical tool. Same thing for the Mount Ida Dam, and for a couple others that we looked at that had just the Girl Scout Dam. There were a number of them that are by and large, in terms of volume, lacked either the ability to do the drawdown or had much volume to offer. But the Denim Reservoir was one that could really offer a lot of storage if you wanted to engage in pre-storm drawdown activities. Wetland detention is really sort of a key finding of our project. The concept is to enhance temporary wetland water storage. There are over 2,000 acres of wetlands in the Rensselaer Plateau headwaters and another 1,700 wetland acres at lower elevations in the watershed. I just wanted to show you this image. This is just from Google Earth. So shameless resource that we all love to use. But downstream of Dyken Pond, there's a whole series of very substantial DEC wetlands. I'm running my cursor around each one, and once you see them, suddenly they're inescapably obvious in this watershed. And each one of them has a meandering stream segment through it, but also has a very large associated a wetland complex area. And they're like a series of sausages, if you will, odd-shaped sausages, my apology to any butchers. But in any case, the water just moves from one to the next. The geology is fascinating because they have relatively steep walls and they have a very constrained outlet in each case. All the water leaving the wetland complex has to travel through a very narrow channel and then flows out into the next one. And we really have the glaciers to thank for this. There are really only a few geologic factors that can create closed depressions, and glaciers are one of them. And so across the top of the plateau here, as the glacier came and went, it left these basins, and now they're occupied by a series of wetlands with a stream flowing through them. But each one of them represents a place. The other thing that's unique is because they are not heavily settled, because they're not encircled like they might be closer to Troy, with dozens and dozens of houses or other special properties or roads, the level of the water in the wetland is relatively immaterial to at least human assets. And because they're wetlands, they're already predisposed to storing water on them. So the concept was, can we detain water a little longer in these wetlands? Instead of having the water flow through in 1 day or 2 days or 3 days, could the water flow through in 3 days, 5 days, or 6 days? That difference we modeled, and we figured out it could make a huge difference downstream. And that becomes the argument for a project here. So we looked at approximately 12 wetlands, which collectively are downstream from something like 30%, 15 wetlands, I apologize, that collectively are the bottlenecks to about 30% of the watershed coverage. And we realized that with some very small geoengineered changes to the outlet of each wetland, if we could make them, thinking of my movie theater for a moment, if we could reduce them from 6 doors to 4 doors, water would stay in each wetland just a little bit longer. And there would be a temporary backup of water in each wetland that might impound an extra foot of water, 1.5 feet of water for a day. No harm to the wetland, it's wetland vegetation. But by doing that, the rate at which the peak was transmitted downstream, cumulatively, we modeled, would lower the flood level going through the city of Troy by a little over a foot, which sounds like nothing, but it's actually an astonishing accomplishment. People are very, very proud of themselves if they lower a flood by inches. And this concept, which relied on nature, storing water in remote locations with what I'm going to show you are very low-tech wetland outlet detention structures, would protect the downstream areas all the way from these headwater locations, all the way through the Route 2 Quack and Kill segment, all the way through the Post and Kill upper segments, all the way through Brunswick, where you have the areas where we saw the floodplains, and all the way past McChesney extension, and then through Troy, where, as you know, if you've been down there, there are steep concrete walls and houses immediately adjacent. And if we can keep the water level just below that storm wall, there's a world of difference between it's below the wall or over the wall. So that 1 foot opportunity is pretty amazing. And the help, all the rest in the watershed is pretty exciting too. So what might this look like? The design options are all very simple. Here, what we have in the dark gray is the existing topography and the stream bed. The thought is build a little bit of a raised bank on both sides. And in both cases, because as I showed you in the aerial photos, this landscape rises rather steeply anyway. These are short, and they don't need to be very high. We're only trying to detain another 1 or 2 feet of water on top of the wetland. So really, what we're building is sort of a neck. We're not disturbing the bed and banks of the stream. We met with the DEC, and they were very clear. They do not want us, and we did not ask, because the bed and banks of a stream is normally sized by the stream because it sort of cuts its channel for the 3 to 5 year storm event. What we're trying to do is we're trying to control the 25-year storm or greater. So we don't need to be in the bed and banks. We just want to build a little berm that's about 2 feet high that just bridges the interval between here and where the natural bedrock rises, so that we throttle the outlet flow just a little bit and temporarily detain water on that wetland for a matter of days. So you can either do it with earthen berms, or you can do it with what looks like picket fences, but it's basically posts with treated lumber so that it lasts a long time. Or Interfluve came up with a version that looks very natural, where you drive posts in and you use a bunch of tree litter and debris and whatnot. And I was a little skeptical when I first looked at this, but you know what? All of this stuff is timber, right? It's logs, and it's large woody debris. And honestly, isn't that what we're actually talking about here? So this is a more natural look. It actually costs a little bit more, but you could build an outlet control device to look very natural, or you could just call it what it is and have about a 2-foot high. This is not a fence with openings. This is lapped close together, so you really block the water, or you could cover it with earth. So those are some options, and all of them are fairly inconspicuous, and they're all from the top of the bed and banks until they tie into the local rising geology. So here's just a concept, right? And my little blue bars here are way too big, but if I put them to scale, you wouldn't have seen them. But the thought is, here's an existing wetland. It's surrounded by forest. If by just necking the outlet a little bit, the next time there's a 100-year flood event, you could store 2 feet of water on this wetland for about 2 days, and it would just drain out a little bit more slowly than it otherwise would. And then you do that in the next wetland down. That is the concept here. We've identified 15 candidate locations. We've met with the DEC about permitting. This made them scratch their eyes and their heads a little bit. This is not what they normally think about. They set some targets for us that if there was a pilot project that they would want some things monitored and they would want to understand it, but they didn't say no. And that's pretty exciting because the estuary program funded this study. They want us to work with nature to try to do better than just building stone walls and gabions and concrete everywhere. On some way, they need to meet us halfway. So they were ready. So we have the conceptual designs, and by putting these in sequentially, each one of them by themselves doesn't make a big difference. But by the time you get through these collectively, they make a huge difference for the watershed. And the other thing that I love about them is that unlike the Denim Reservoir, where you need a person, a commitment, and an excuse afterwards if it was needed or it wasn't needed, guess what? These are passive. These sit here, they're sentinels. Once you build them, you check them once a year to make sure that, I don't know, something didn't happen to them. But if the storm event comes up at 2 a.m., they're gonna detain water. If the storm comes up at, on a weekend, they're gonna detain water. If there's a change in the political climate in your municipality, unless somebody rips them out, they're gonna detain water. I mean, the neat thing about them is once you build them, and they're cheap, right? You saw that they're just posts and lattice, or there's some stone stuff relative to so many projects. When we did cost benefit analysis on this relative to the downstream harm, and they were unbelievably cost effective. So it's novel, and we need a pilot test because the DEC really wants to see one done. And we think that this is a pretty exciting opportunity, really because of the unique situation of the Rensselaer Plateau. Most wetlands that I'm familiar with in the lower Hudson Valley are ringed with people. They're ringed with roads. They're ringed with houses. If you were to tell me that you were going to raise the water level even for a day in one of those wetlands because of an artificial detention structure, you'd have people howling because it would be their roads, their basements, their anything. But these wetlands, because of the geography of the plateau and the fact that the geology has already given you fairly steep sides and fairly constrained outlets already, if you just tweak those outlets to be a little bit narrower, you can make a world of good downstream as a fairly low tech, high concept benefit. Let's see. So I just wanted to show you. I tried to put these things all together. I was trying to be too cute. So there's one, and then this is what it looks like. It's just the outlet control. That's what those 2 blue boxes are, just for demo purposes. So I just wanted to show you, having gotten enthusiastic about this, I wanted to show you one more time sort of the distribution of these 15 conceptual. I will say very quickly that we have not spoken with these 15 people. I think Jim Bonesteel and others would be a little concerned that somebody might want to focus in on these and say, hey, that's my property, you haven't talked to me. The answer is, you're right, we know. These aren't necessarily the only locations they could be proposed. This is what we modeled because we thought that the geology and the constrainedness and the remoteness of these particular wetlands would be well suited to this. But I want to also put the little disclaimer in there that this project didn't have the budget to go out to start knocking on doors. So let's see. I'm almost done, and we're at, yeah, in fact, I'm very close to, this is my last slide. So as a close, I just want to point out that we've talked about resilience, and that this study focused on resilience, restoring stream banks, restoring bed and banks as a way to make them more resistant to the next event, given kind of putting Humpty Dumpty back together in some places. There are some strategic projects that I did not bother to talk about this evening that have to do with a couple culverts that we absolutely identified as being undersized and just should be upgraded. There were a couple bridges that this study hydraulic identified should be wider span. But I think that the bulk of the argument is that if those are all very expensive projects, and when we do the cost benefit analysis, if one could also, in the spirit of detention, look at dam drawdown at Dunham, and very importantly, start implementing one after another some of these temporary detention projects in existing wetlands, what you mitigate is the cost of needing to upsize even more culverts in the watershed, or build more storm walls in key locations, or exacerbate the situation at the McChesney extension location. There is damage that you can either prevent or slow down by implementing some of these detention strategies. And that was a very exciting finding. And the modeling suggested it, and the engineers, I'm not an engineer, I'm a hydrogeologist, but our hydraulic engineers were saying, yep, this could really work. And the geomorphology people felt like this could work. And the people on our committee who were tied in with Trout Unlimited and other ecologically focused entities felt like this collection of things could really work. So we felt like we had some collective sense of closure on a set of plans. So that's my last slide. My inclination is to pull my slides down and then just have a conversation. Does that make sense, Alice? I'm not hearing anybody speaking.
There are a couple of questions here in chat.
Great.
Here we go. Wouldn't individual towns also be involved in permitting?
They may well. There may be some towns that have some of their own stream disturbance issues, and we'd have to approach them one by one. I think that we knew that the gorilla in the room was like, because we were talking about DEC regulated wetlands. We didn't even want to float this idea until we had a pre-conference with the DEC to determine whether they were just going to say no out of hand. I think what we will discover with the first pilot project, maybe the first pilot in each town, is whether there's a local difficulty. I would hope not. It's a pretty intuitively obvious kind of an opportunity.
Okay. Can you speak a bit about how the bedload transport during a peak flow affects aquatic organisms?
Wow, I think the short answer is no. I'm not a fishing person. What I've always been told is that during storm events, trout and others will find an eddy somewhere and stay on the backside of it and just endure. I have no idea what happens when there is no eddy. I would assume that some of them find themselves in the Hudson.
Okay. And how does the amount and maturity of forest cover on the plateau relate to stormwater management? That's
a forestry question. There may be a person who is tuned in this evening who has a better sense of the forest. The difference between a mature and a juvenile forest is not something that we looked at closely. What we saw was established forest. And what we saw was forest that came down to the banks of those wetlands that I showed you. And it was our hypothesis that temporarily raising the water level in those wetlands by a foot or two was not going to make a difference to the vitality of the forest at whatever stage of succession it was, because the geology, it keeps those forests above the level of the wetland pretty reliably.
Okay. Can you share website map of wetlands on the plateau?
I'm not going to try to be brave and play with my share screen again, but the easiest and best resource for that is easily described. If you Google New York State DEC environmental mapper, it will take you to a beautiful interactive GIS website where you can turn wetlands on and off, the federal wetlands on and off, such as that they have endangered species criteria locations. So that's a really neat website that'll give you any one of these websites very easily. So that's DEC environmental mapper. If you Google that, it'll come up very, very quickly.
And what about ground dwelling animals?
Ground dwelling animals? I'm not sure. I'll talk for a second here. I don't really, I wish I knew more a little bit what the questioner is asking about, but during.
She says rabbits, etc.
Okay, well, I would, if I was a rabbit and I occasionally liked hanging out in a wetland, I think during a storm event, I would try to get out of the wetland. Once again, these wetlands are surrounded by fairly mature forest, so there would be plenty of highland for the rabbit to go to. And then for the wetland, the creatures, a turtle or snakes, or I'm really not a wetland ecologist, but for the kinds of critters that live uniquely in wetlands, once again, when we met with the DEC, what the questions that they asked were related to whether we would be making the wetland uninhabitable for those kind of creatures, even for twice as long as they might normally be flooded during a real flood anyway. And that was part of the observation information that they were going to want us to collect when we do our first pilot project. I think our gut is they are going to be slow. The thing that would be most disturbing to wetland creatures would be if a wetland was turned into a river. And our intention with these wetland outlet controls is that in fact it's detaining flat water in the wetland. So there isn't much current, and anything is, it's just going to have a slightly deeper depth of inundation or a little longer than it might normally. So we didn't anticipate that there would be any meaningful impact to habitat in the wetland.
Are farms on the plateau being incentivized in any way to install swales like in the old days and perennial ecosystems? Was farmland analyzed in this study for its contribution to runoff?
No, we, this was a 96 square mile model. So we assigned some general slope and runoff factors to different categories of landscape. And we were not looking at the volume of sediment removed. We were looking at estimated volumes of water. And so whether it was a farm field or a golf course or a lawn, all of those are, lightly vegetated and water flows off pretty quickly. I might add, I guess I would add that I don't think that the footprint of agriculture on the plateau is extensive, except in a few places proximate to the posting kill.
And what would be the risks associated with a potential causing a constriction getting clogged with debris during a heavy rain like a hurricane?
That's a very good question, and it came up in the DEC discussions. One of the questions, that exact question, which is if you narrow the outlet of an upland wetland, is there a risk that it will in fact block? And I guess there are for one thing, I think experience is going to teach us some things, but there were a couple of thoughts. One is, yes, it's a possible risk, but it is, except in extreme circumstances, it's probably self-cleaning, because the more constricted it is, the velocity of water movement through the one channel is fairly high. So it's likely to keep itself cleared, unless something is really blocked across the throat. And the second answer is, we don't anticipate these to be set them and forget them and never visit them. We expect them to be serviced periodically, visited once or twice a year to make sure that if something gets clogged, they get cleared. And lastly, for those of you who know wetlands, they are low energy environments. The water movement is slow. If a tree adjacent to the wetland falls in, it tends to fall into the section of the wetland that has low water velocity movement. So it's not a location where you're expecting to see a lot of large debris move toward the outlet, as a general rule. But once again, they would need to be serviced, and there is the possibility. During the storm event, it wouldn't really matter, right? If it clogged, it just would drain more slowly than it might otherwise, which actually would benefit the downstream community. It just would not allow the wetland to drain out as quickly as we would like it to.
This looks like a comment, Rachel, I'm not sure. Undisturbed and well-developed forest soils have a substantial water holding capacity. That's true.
I don't mean to be completely dismissive of upland soils. I didn't mean to offend them or their advocates.
That was just it. You had asked somebody from forestry should answer this one. So I
Yes.
put in a little blip that yes, forest.
Particular. Yeah, go ahead.
The land cover is does have an effect, and forest is a big factor, right? And forest soils have huge capacity.
They have huge capacity. I guess it is a huge capacity, but how it ranks, for example, relative to a deep sandy soil, on Cape Cod or something like that, there is still a big difference. But there's no doubt that a well-developed forest cover is a fabulous anchor to the soils. And if the soil has not been exposed for a long time, it builds up a wonderful soil profile. But most of the soils on the profile on the plateau are derived from glacial till. So they're very silty. And so they're not as porous as a real sand matrix soil. Am I making any sense, Rachel?
Probably, yeah. The depth of the it's sort of like the forest, the developed forest soil, and I know there's others on the call who could help too. The organic layer, as much as the mineral layer, is in a developed forest soil, is what's doing a lot of the absorbing too.
All true.
Nick Conrad, I think this is an answer to a previous question. He is suggesting the New York DEC Environmental Resource Mapper.
Yes. That's where many of us go when we first start thinking about a crazy idea. And it's like, okay, well, what's already there? Is that is there a DEC wetland? Is there a special habitat of some sort or another that we should know about? What should we know about before we even start opining about a piece of property? So yes, thank you for providing that link.
Was the McChesney extension exposure the only glacial sediment derived washout that was taken into account as at risk in the case of another Irene type event?
We met with each of the municipalities, and that one certainly rose to the surface more highly than others. There were I toured a lot of stream location in Post-and-Kill that was pretty gouged up behind the firehouse and other places. I mean, there's, I guess the place that has the single largest bank that I was shown was that one. There were sections in Brunswick, certainly, and near the soccer fields and near the Wagner farm, and there were other locations where there's certainly damage, but that one jumped out to multiple people, and so I think that the working group felt like it needed to be addressed specifically.
Did you note any beaver dams at the outlets during your assessment? And would beaver activities influence the performance of the flood structures?
Beavers are probably, let me say that I got to very few of these wetlands. They were in remote locations, as I just showed you with aerial photos. So I saw a few of them, but I didn't see close to 15 of them. What I heard was, and people here who are more familiar with that plateau than I could chime in and have an opinion, but what I heard was that during Irene, that whole section of wetland complexes downstream of Dike and Pond had many, many beaver dams, many of which washed out simultaneously, which contributed to the debris load that caused some damage downstream. I don't know to what degree that's true. But that said, I would expect beavers are going to continue to live in those locations if it suits them now. And part of the management of these outlet structures may be to prevent them being routinely blocked by beavers.
Russell, I think that's the end of the questions. So
Okay.
On behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you for a really interesting and informative talk. Particularly fascinating that, there's a natural way to deal with floods. And so thank you very much. And
My pitch is, if anybody either knows the owners for one of these wetlands or can think of what is a budget streams, I know that the Rensselaer Plateau Alliance and we are just eager to get a pilot project going, because we think that this could really revolutionize not just stormwater management on Rensselaer Plateau, but would be looked at very quickly as a model in other locations where there's similar to geometry, as a low-tech, high-concept, easy way to work with nature and manage floods. So thanks for the opportunity to talk together this evening, and it's been a pleasure.
thanks very much. So I think we'll end the meeting.
Okay.
Thanks, Russell.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks, Keith.
Thanks, Russell.